Malik Turner didn't walk into that building to be noticed. That part of him, the young dreamer, who once raised his hand first in every class, the student who ran the debate team, who had a partial scholarship to study civil rights law, he was long gone. Now Malik clocked in after the city went to sleep. Quiet shoes, blue uniform with a patch that said Turner, keys jingling against his hip. He cleaned the top floors first, always starting where the men in suits spent their days, where gold nameplates sat on oak desks and private conversations left whispers in the walls. He didn't speak to anyone. That was the unspoken rule. Janitors. Clean, not question. He emptied trash cans full of secret shredded files, handwritten notes, half-finished plans to evict families from neighborhoods with names like Lincoln Heights and Westvale Row. He scrubbed coffee stains off tables where boardroom decisions had been made without a single black voice present. He wiped windows so clear that men with no conscience could look out and feel proud of what they built on other people's backs. They walked past him every morning, some barely nodding, some not even seeing him. Malik didn't need them to. He listened more than they knew. The echo of legal jargon, real estate deals, and tax loopholes wasn't just noise to him, it was ammo. He remembered every name, every neighborhood mentioned, every slur said when they thought no one could hear. Because janitors aren't people, right? They're fixtures, they're background. They're paid to be silent. Malik had done that part well for 4 years, not because he lacked pride, but because he knew power listens only when it's forced to. And Malik was preparing for that moment. Every night, after his shift, he'd go home to a one-room apartment above a closed barber shop. He'd kick off the boots, wash his hands raw, then open a battered laptop with a flickering screen. On it, he collected everything: names, dates, patterns, photos of documents accidentally left in the open. He kept files like a lawyer would, because once, he was almost one. His mother used to tell him, "You can be tired, but don't be done." And every time he looked at her picture on the wall, hooked in a cheap frame, he remembered why he started working nights, to pay for her chemo. She died before the second round. After that, Malik stopped believing he'd ever be more than a mop and a key ring, until that one file changed everything. It was a Thursday night. Rain tapped the office windows like a ticking clock. On the 12th floor, the corner office lights were still on. That meant the lawyers were out late. Malik waited. He knew that corner office belonged to senior partner Benjamin Clark, a man known for clean suits, dirty contracts, and a voice that dripped condescension. When Clark finally left, Malik stepped in to clean it. When he saw it, a folder left open on the desk, labeled Lincoln Heights Eviction, Cycle Phase 3. There it was, in plain ink: coordinates, expected legal resistance, names of families who still lived there, and even suggested methods to expedite vacancy. One note read, "Use code enforcement threats if necessary." Malik stood frozen. He knew one of those names. Mrs. Givens, his 5th grade math teacher. She still lived in her father's old house. He'd walked past it last Thanksgiving when he visited the neighborhood. That folder was a death sentence for her and dozens of others, and now it was in his hands. He didn't panic. He didn't storm out. He did what they never expected. He scanned every page using his phone, emailed it to himself, and carefully placed the folder exactly how he found it. Then, he left. But that night, he didn't go straight home. He walked 3 extra blocks in the rain, to a small, independent newsroom he used to deliver papers to as a teen. The lights were off, but he knew the back entrance. Inside, he found an old editor named Ron Wallace, a gruff white man who had once covered local housing scams before advertisers shut him down. Ron hadn't seen Malik in years, but the look in Malik's eyes cut through the years like glass. Malik dropped his phone on the desk. "I need this to be real," he said, "and I need it to be loud." Ron read the files, his brows tightening. "You know what this means, right?" "Yeah," Malik replied. "It means I'm finally using my voice." The next morning, headlines broke like thunder across the city. Janitor exposes eviction ring targeting black communities. Names were named, addresses listed. Malik didn't hide. He signed his name at the bottom of the report. Just one line: Malik Turner, custodian's son, and former law student. By noon, every camera in the city was looking for him. The storm didn't come gently. It came like sirens, like headlines flashing on every TV, like suits scrambling to cover tracks they thought were buried under silence. But the silence was gone now. Malik's voice had filled its place, not shouted, not screamed, just spoken with the kind of calm that leaves no room for doubt. By Friday morning, Malik Turner's name was on every social feed. Not because he wanted fame, but because the truth finally found a way out. Through him. The news anchors, said Janitor. But they didn't understand what that word meant when it was worn by a man who'd once held law textbooks tighter than sleep. They called him a former dropout, but no one talked about why he dropped out or who he dropped out for. And in the firm's gleaming office tower, panic spread like spilled ink. Partner Benjamin Clark slammed his office door shut, shouting for PR damage control. Legal associates scrambled to distance themselves. The same people who used to ignore Malik as he mopped under their feet now begged each other for statements, for memory gaps, for anything that wouldn't incriminate them. But the paper trail was too long, too loud, and too clear. Meanwhile, Malik sat quietly in Ron Wallace's old office, sipping bitter coffee from a chipped mug, his phone buzzing every few seconds. Community organizers, civil rights attorneys, council members who never returned his letters before, now they all wanted meetings. Malik didn't smile. Not yet. Not until Lincoln Heights was safe. Not until Mrs. Givens and families like hers knew they weren't alone anymore. And not until the city stopped treating black neighborhoods like stepping stones for luxury condos. The following week, the city council held an emergency housing hearing. It was packed. Folding chairs overflowed. Cameras pointed in every direction, and right at the center table sat Malik Turner, not in a janitor's uniform this time, but in a plain black button-up and a clip-on tie someone had gifted him years ago. His hand shook slightly as he opened his statement. The crowd hushed. My name is Malik Turner. Some of you may know me as the night janitor who cleans your offices, but I used to be something else. A student, a son, a believer. I gave that up to take care of my mother. And when she died, I thought I'd lost my place in the world. But I didn't. I just found it somewhere you didn't expect in silence. And now that silence is over. Gasps scattered. One councilwoman wept. A woman in the back whispered, "That's him." For 4 years, Malik continued, I walked through your buildings, cleaning up after men who thought the city was theirs to divide. I saw how you planned to remove us, not just from homes, but from maps, from memory. But I remember, and I know I'm not alone. Applause thundered. Even the council members who came with pre-written speeches folded their notes. After that day, everything shifted. The law firm tried to deny knowledge, but emails leaked. So did video footage, old security tapes showing Malik working quietly in those rooms, proving his presence. No one could claim it was made up. Not when the janitor became the historian. Investigations followed. Clark was suspended. The firm's name lost weight. But more importantly, evictions were halted. Lincoln Heights won a temporary stay. And Malik didn't go back to cleaning floors. Not because he thought he was above it, but because he'd stepped into something greater. He was invited to join a legal team for housing justice. Not as a janitor, not even as a client, but as a strategist. As a voice, as someone who knew the game from both sides. The same office that once ignored his presence now needed his insight. And even then, Malik never demanded revenge. Just change. Real change. He walked through his old neighborhood a month later. The same cracked sidewalks, the same corner store. But now people stopped to shake his hand. You did that? Someone said, you saved my mother's house. Kids waved at him from porch steps. That's the janitor guy, one yelled. Malik smiled, the first real smile in years. Because it wasn't about revenge. It was about return. About rising. About proving that no uniform, no job title, no silence could bury the voice of a black man who knew his worth. The city may have cheered for Malik Turner, but systems don't fall that easily, not when they've spent decades building walls made of silence. Protected by polished smiles and carefully worded laws. After the council hearing, Malik thought, the hard part was over, but truth, once spoken, rarely rests. Within 2 weeks, retaliation came dressed in legalese. Malik received a letter, short, cold, and heavy as a brick. Defamation suit, Turner v. Clark and Associates. It was a message, a warning, from the very firm he used to clean. The same men who never looked him in the eye were now trying to break him in court. Malik sat with the letter in both hands, staring at the bold black font like it was an old enemy he recognized too well. They weren't trying to clear their name, they were trying to scare him back into the shadows. But Malik had already lived in silence long enough. He met with Ron Wallace again, this time joined by an entire team from a nonprofit law firm, black-led, grassroots, and hungry for a fight. When they saw the evidence Malik had collected over the years, every email, voice memo, file photo, and handwritten note, they knew this wasn't just about one man. It was about a blueprint, a system, a machine that thrived off invisible labor and targeted neglect. They didn't just agree to defend Malik, they asked him to help lead the case. A new countersuit was filed, Turner v. Clark and Associates. Civil suit for unlawful retaliation, targeted harassment, and violation of housing ethics. The headlines flipped again. Suddenly, the janitor wasn't just a whistleblower, he was becoming a legal force. Community leaders started fundraising, black churches organized rallies. The same people who once passed Malik by on the sidewalk now stood shoulder to shoulder with him in protest lines. The first court date was set for a stormy Monday morning. Malik arrived not with lawyers and suits behind him, but with a crowd. Dozens marched with him up the courthouse steps. He wore a simple black hoodie, no brand names, no message printed across the chest. Just black, just real. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick. Clark's legal team filled their side with expensive suits, sharp shoes, and sharpened tongues. They called Malik's actions reckless, said he had compromised confidential information, painted him as disgruntled and vengeful. But Malik's team didn't flinch, because facts don't waver. Malik's lawyer, a sharp-spoken, black woman named Tasha Freeman, stepped forward with her opening words. My client isn't a janitor seeking revenge. He's a citizen who witnessed exploitation, collected proof, and demanded accountability when no one else dared to. If silence is what protected corruption, then Malik Turner is what broke that silence open. And then it was Malik's turn. The courtroom went still. He stood, hands slightly trembling, but voice steady. I didn't break into files. They were left in the open. I didn't invent names. I recognized them. I didn't shout on rooftops. I wrote a letter. I trusted that truth would speak for itself. And if I'm being punished for that, then let it be clear. This courtroom isn't about law anymore. It's about fear. The jury watched him like they were seeing something they weren't supposed to. A janitor? Yes, but also a man who understood the system better than those who built it. Clark tried to smirk through it all, but the cracks were showing. Day by day, evidence was presented. Memos signed in his hand. Client files with racist notes in the margins. Audio clips of meetings where neighborhoods were discussed like property auctions. The mask slipped, and beneath it was something rotten. On the 6th day of trial, a bombshell came. A former paralegal testified, a white woman who had quietly quit months earlier. She took the stand and said, "We all knew what was happening. We just didn't think anyone would ever speak out. We never thought the janitor would become the one we'd answer to." Gasps spread. Even the judge sat back. Clark's lawyers tried to object, but it was too late. The truth had walked through the front door and sat down in open court. The case stretched 2 more weeks. Outside, Malik's name was now spoken in marches, in sermons, in classrooms. Murals began to appear in neighborhoods, a man in uniform, holding a mop in one hand, a folder in the other. Truth can't be mopped away. One read, then came the verdict. The courtroom was silent as the jury returned. Malik stood. The world felt slow, heavy. The judge read the ruling. Clark and associates were found liable for targeted harassment, unethical legal practices, and unlawful retaliatory behavior. The crowd in the courtroom didn't cheer, not yet. Malik just closed his eyes, exhaled deeply, and nodded once. Outside, as the doors opened, reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. But Malik didn't speak to them, not right away. He walked to the same courthouse steps he'd climbed 2 weeks earlier, stood before the crowd, and raised the mic with a voice that shook not from fear but from something older, stronger. I was supposed to stay quiet. I was supposed to mop, to scrub, to fade into corners. But I remembered what my mother told me. She said, "You clean what they see, but you never have to carry what they hide." And so I didn't. I gave it back. I gave it all back. And this time, the silence didn't return. It shattered. The case was over, but truth doesn't end with a gavel. Truth doesn't clock out. It lingers. It spreads. It plants itself in places power never bothers to water. For Malik Turner, the verdict wasn't a finish line. It was just the sound of the door unlocking. And what came next was louder than anything he had ever imagined. The news didn't just cover it, they dissected it. National anchors told his story with carefully neutral tones. But the people told it with fire. Black barbershops turned up the volume on the hearing footage. Churches replayed his words during Sunday sermons. Schools brought his story into classrooms, teaching students that justice doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes, it wears worn-out boots and carries a mop. But for Malik, the spotlight felt heavier than victory, because while the world celebrated him, he was still walking home alone to the same small apartment above the barbershop, where his mother's photo waited like always, frozen in time, wrapped in a smile that reminded him of why he started this journey. There were moments he questioned if it was worth it. Not the truth. He'd never doubt that, but the price. The sleepless nights, the death threats. The firm had its supporters too, and they didn't stay quiet. Anonymous. Emails, letters shoved under his door. Stay in your place. You got lucky. Next time there won't be a trial. But even fear didn't move him the way injustice once had. He'd stood in court and watched a system shake. He wasn't about to step back into the shadows. A few weeks after the trial, Malik was asked to speak at a community conference on housing justice. He almost said no. He didn't want the fame, but something in him knew the fight wasn't over. Not really. So he showed up. Not with a speech, not with a slideshow, but with a folder. The same kind of folder he once cleaned around for years. He held it up and said, "This is how they tried to erase us. Quietly, in ink, in file cabinets. This is how neighborhoods disappear. But not anymore. Not while we're watching. Not while we're speaking." That moment went viral again. Hashtags lit up social media. Hashtag folder of truth. Hashtag black janitor no more. Hashtag Turner was watching. And something strange started happening. Other janitors started speaking out. From cities Malik had never even visited. Night workers, mailroom clerks, security guards, people who had been invisible for decades were now telling their stories. Too, stories of wage theft, of silence, of racism dressed in professionalism. Malik hadn't just won a case. He had cracked open a door so wide, others started pouring. 3 was invited to Washington, D.C. to meet with housing policy advocates. Then to a university that once rejected him due to low re-enrollment priority. They now offered him an honorary degree. Malik smiled politely, thanked them, but declined. He didn't need their degree to know his worth. Instead, he used that attention to launch something bigger. He created the Silent Floor Initiative, a nationwide platform giving night workers legal tools, community allies, and direct access. 2 whistleblower protections, no long applications, no gatekeeping, just a hotline. A network, a promise. If you've been quiet for too long, we'll be your voice until you find yours. The first case they helped. A hospital custodian in Atlanta who exposed medical overbilling that was costing black patients their coverage. The second, a warehouse worker in Milwaukee who proved his managers were changing clock-out times to steal overtime from immigrant employees. Malik didn't lead every case. He didn't need to. He had already done the hardest part, believing that his voice mattered, and convincing others that theirs did too. But the weight didn't leave him. One night, months later, he found himself back on the roof of his apartment building. The city below buzzed in quiet hums. He sat down, hoodie up, alone under the stars. He reached into his bag, pulled out the folder that started it all. He still kept it, not for revenge, not for pride, but to remember. Inside the folder was a single photo now, a picture of his mother holding him outside their Lincoln Heights apartment, her face full of hope, not knowing the battles ahead. Malik whispered, "We did it, Ma, but it ain't over." And he was right. Because movements don't end in courtrooms. They live in whispers turned into words, in silence turned into songs. Monday morning came like a storm behind frosted glass, cold, gray, and humming with anticipation. The building, once a fortress of whispered gossip and polished silence, felt different now, like it had been cracked open by a single voice that refused to go back into the shadows. Malik stood outside the main entrance, not in uniform, not with cleaning gloves in his back pocket, but in a deep charcoal blazer, freshly ironed pants, and a pair of brown leather shoes that had waited years for this day. He didn't bring a sign. He didn't bring a megaphone. Just truth. And that was loud enough. The security guard, Marcus, gave him a nod, the kind that said, "I see you." Not the usual head tilt you give someone invisible. No. This one carried weight. Malik walked past him, through the automatic glass doors of the Hartley Tower, the very building where he'd cleaned every floor, mopped every corner, and learned every unspoken hierarchy like it was written on the walls. Today, he wasn't invisible. The city had read his letter on unapologetic and truthful, and they had listened. Media vans now sat parked on both sides of the street. Office workers, some anxious, some curious, peered out from behind glass conference rooms. Inside, HR had no idea what to do. The board had met all weekend, their phones burning with emails from sponsors, news anchors, and community leaders. There was talk of damage control. But Malik didn't come for apologies or a check. He came for something deeper. At 9 a.m. sharp, Malik walked into conference room B, the same room he once vacuumed while board members mocked low-level staff. Only this time, every seat was filled with executives, journalists, union reps, and 2 community leaders invited to observe. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but truth doesn't need a lens. It echoes. As Malik stood behind the podium, silence swept across the room like a tidal wave pulling back. He looked at each face, some red with shame, some stiff with denial, and some just confused at how someone like him ended up here. But he didn't shake, he didn't blink. His voice came steady, like water cutting through rock. "I spent 12 years cleaning your offices. I scrubbed your mistakes off glass walls. I emptied your secrets from trash cans. And I listened. You don't realize how loud your silence is when you think no one's watching." Someone shifted in their chair. Malik continued, "You used to joke about the janitor ghost, the guy who's always there but no one's seen. But I saw you. I saw how you treated the interns with rich last names different from the ones with accents. I saw how promotions didn't land unless you looked the part. And I saw how you walked past me like I was furniture, until now." A sharp breath cut through the silence. "I didn't write that letter for revenge. I wrote it for every other invisible worker who learned to swallow dignity just to survive. I wrote it for the girl in accounting who stopped wearing her natural hair after she was told it was unprofessional. I wrote it for Marcus downstairs, who's been here longer than all of you and still doesn't get medical." A woman in the back wiped a tear from her cheek. Malik kept going. "I'm not here for a job. I'm here for a reckoning. You built this place on silence. I'm just making sure it ends with a voice." When he finished, no one clapped. Not because I didn't want to, but because it felt like clapping at a funeral. The death of denial. Malik stepped away from the podium and walked out, not needing permission, not needing thanks. Outside, the crowd had grown. Hundreds of people, from teachers to nurses, from students to city council members, all gathered, holding printed copies of Malik's letter, reading it aloud, paragraph by paragraph. It had become a movement. One man's words ignited what years of quiet could not. And as he walked down the steps, the crowd parted not out of fear, but out of respect. He didn't raise his fist. He didn't smile. He just nodded, the same way Marcus did earlier. Because sometimes, you don't need to say, "I made it." The world already knows. The auditorium was silent as Malik stepped onto the stage. He wasn't dressed like the others in suits and crisp collars. No, he came as he was, the janitor who once cleaned this very floor. His uniform was pressed but humble. His posture, proud but burdened with everything he had carried for years in silence. There were cameras now. not hidden, not secret. Journalists, community leaders, students, and city officials filled the seats, waiting to hear from the man who had become a symbol. But Malik didn't speak right away. He stood there, eyes scanning the crowd slowly, as if daring the city to see him now fully. Finally, he reached into his pocket, not for notes or a speech, but for the faded keycard he once used to swipe into the back door of that cold office building. This, he began, holding it up, was all I had for a long time. A key, but no voice. The silence in the room grew heavy. He continued, his voice steady, raw. Every night, I cleaned your offices, your bathrooms, your boardrooms. I scrubbed the floors where your secrets leaked. I heard things you thought no one was listening to because you never saw me as a person, just a shadow with a mop. The audience was frozen. Even those who had doubted his story couldn't look away now. Malik walked across the stage slowly. I watched promotions passed around like poker chips. I saw women belittled in closed rooms. I saw black interns overworked and discarded. I watched my own people apologize for existing just to survive. I didn't have a degree, but I had ears. I didn't wear a tie, but I saw the truth. He paused, his voice cracked just slightly, and I kept quiet. For rent, for insurance, for food. But then Malik did something no one expected. He held up the crumpled email he had printed out, the same message that had exposed everything. You remember this, right? He said, facing the board members seated in the front row. This was the night you made your biggest mistake. You said the quiet part out loud, and I just printed it. The tension broke for a moment. A few nervous laughs, but Malik wasn't done. He turned to the crowd. This isn't just about me. This is about every black man and woman who's ever been told to stay in their place. About every worker who's been called too loud for speaking the truth. About every quiet janitor who knows more than you think. From the back, an elderly black woman stood and clapped once, then twice. Then a wave of applause rose like a storm. Malik didn't cry. He just looked down at the floor, the same type of floor he'd polished for years, and let the moment sit. Later that evening, Malik's speech would be broadcast across the country. He'd be invited to panels, podcasts, and interviews. But none of that compared to what happened the next day. The company where he had worked, the same one that had tried to quietly settle the matter, announced that they were not only changing their executive leadership, but also initiating a full-scale racial equity audit to be overseen by an independent counsel. But Malik didn't show up to gloat. He didn't want a corner office. He didn't want revenge. What he wanted and what he finally got was dignity. Back in his neighborhood, children who once saw him sweeping streets now pointed to him with admiration. That's Mr. Malik. He stood up to them, they'd say, and at the community center that had barely stayed open through years of cuts. Malik donated quietly in full and made sure its doors would never close again. One night, he sat alone on a bench, looking out over the skyline. He still wore his janitor's boots, still kept that keycard in his pocket. But something had changed. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't silent. He had become a voice, one that echoed beyond the marble floors and glass towers of downtown. A voice that told every quiet, overlooked black worker, you are not alone. You were never meant to stay silent. And in the silence that followed, the city listened. The city had never seen silence like this. Not after a speech. Not after a janitor. But Malik's words didn't just echo in the town square. They burrowed into boardrooms, classrooms, police stations, and morning meetings like a quiet reckoning. Phones buzzed, emails stacked. The mayor's office called an emergency session, and the school board. They were scrambling to erase the very thing they once ignored. Malik's presence, the footage of his voice, steady and haunting, was played on loop across screens from barbershops in Atlanta to dorm rooms in Chicago. But it wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. Quiet, direct, like someone who had nothing left to prove, only something to leave behind. Back at Jefferson, High, the halls that once swallowed Malik's footsteps now whispered his name. Staff members who barely noticed him were now rehearsing apologies, while students walked taller, their eyes burning with something dangerous hope. But Malik didn't return to the school. Instead, he stood outside the city's Civil Rights Museum, staring at a wall of names etched in steel. People who stood when they had no protection, spoke when they had no microphone, fought when there was no one watching. He didn't want to be among them, but the city had made him one. At City Hall, the mayor Laura Graves watched Malik's speech for the third time. She sat in her office surrounded by PR consultants and legal counsel, none of whom could spin what had happened because it wasn't about one man mopping floors. It was about every door that had been quietly shut, and every voice that had been politely ignored. We're not dealing with a scandal, her chief of staff said. We're dealing with a movement. Mayor Graves sighed, took off her glasses, and whispered, then we either stand with it or get buried under it. Meanwhile, Malik's daughter Ayana sat in the front room of their small apartment, staring at her father's face on the news. Not a meme, not a punchline. Not the man who worked 2 jobs and came home quiet, but a leader. A truth-teller. He walked in quietly, set his keys on the counter, and saw her watching. You didn't tell me you were going to speak like that, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't know I was going to, Malik replied. She stood, crossed the room, and hugged him like a man who came back from war. Because in some ways, he had to. Days later, the Jefferson School District announced an internal investigation, but the students weren't waiting for paperwork. They walked out. Hundreds of them black, brown, white, Muslim, queer marched together holding signs that read, "We heard Malik and our janitor taught us more than you did." Reporters followed, cameras rolled, and somewhere in the city, a group of janitors at another school sat together during lunch and dared to talk louder than usual. Malik didn't ask for any of this. He didn't want cameras, protests, or podiums. But when the mayor's office reached out asking him to speak at the upcoming city council meeting, he didn't hesitate. This time he walked in the front door. No back hallways. No service elevators. He wore the same uniform. But now it looked like armored council members shifted in their seats as Malik stood before them. Not angry, not performative, just present. "You all didn't see me? That's all right. I was never here to be seen," he began. "But the kids saw me, and if they can see what you couldn't, maybe they deserve to lead this city more than you do." One of the council members, a woman who once passed Malik every week in the school, lowered her head. "I don't need your pity. I don't need your applause," Malik continued. "I need you to make sure the next Malik gets promoted, not ignored." The room fell silent, not because of shame, but because for the first time, they were listening. Later that night, Malik and Ayana sat on their building's rooftop watching the city lights flicker beneath them. "You changed something, Dad," she said. He shook his head slowly. "No, we changed something. I just said it out loud." She smiled, leaned her head on his shoulder, and whispered, "Say it again sometime." They're still listening. For days after Malik's video ignited the nation, City Hall stood under siege, not with violence, but with candlelight, chants, and stories. The concrete steps turned into confession booths. Black mothers, ex-custodians, retired bus drivers, sons of those who died holding back their tongues, they all came forward now because one man in a blue janitor's uniform had refused to stay quiet. Malik stood behind them, not in front, not above, behind, holding up the voices of others like scaffolding, but for all the public love. Inside the administration, there was silence. Strategic, nervous, corporate silence. The mayor hadn't said a word. The commissioner issued a bland "we're investigating." The company that owned the building Malik cleaned finally released a 2-line apology. 2 lines. After 20 years of backbreaking loyalty, that night, at the vigil, Malik stood with his daughter on his left and Mr. Burroughs on his right. Camille, his daughter, squeezed his arm tight. They said, "Sorry, Daddy," barely. But they said it. Malik looked down, his face unreadable. "They didn't say it to me. They said it to headlines." Mr. Burroughs exhaled slowly. "Then maybe you need to go say something back." Malik turned toward the growing crowd, glowing with candles. "No," he said. "I already did. Now it's their turn to speak." By the next morning, the city council had called an emergency meeting, not because of pressure from inside, but because the people had made it impossible to ignore. Clips from Malik's speech had aired on every major outlet. Teachers played it in classrooms. Union leaders quoted him in rallies. One college even announced they'd be giving him an honorary doctorate in civil ethics. But Malik, he just went to work. Showed up at 6:15, mop in hand, shirt pressed. When the camera crews found him outside the glass tower, he waved them off. "Go film someone who never got their voice heard. I've had my moment." They haven't. That humility, that silence, that refusal to exploit the moment, it made the city love him even more, and that love began to crack the glass towers. Executives who'd once averted their eyes now scheduled town halls. Boards held accountability. Hearings, policy documents were rewritten with Malik's words at the top. "If I'm invisible while I'm cleaning your mess, then maybe the real mess isn't on the floor." But perhaps the most unexpected ripple came from inside the very building where he was shamed. Erica, the HR officer who once dismissed his quiet complaints, stood outside the staff break room holding a brown paper envelope. Inside it, her resignation letter. Malik saw her as he was about to wheel his cart past. She looked up, eyes red. "No makeup. Real. I don't expect you to forgive me," she said. "I just didn't know how blind I was until the city told me what you'd been saying all along." Malik paused. "People aren't blind," he said gently. "They just close their eyes when it's convenient. You opening them now? That's a start. But don't resign. Stay, and fix it from inside. It's easier to clean a room when you're already in it." The moment went viral again, but this time, it wasn't Malik's pain, it was his grace. Elsewhere, ripple effects turned into waves. A janitor in Detroit sued his company for wrongful termination, citing Malik's case as precedent. A group of black hospital aides in Texas formed a union. In Washington, a quiet congressional aide drafted legislation around workplace dignity for low-income workers, nicknaming it Malik's Law. The bill hadn't even passed yet, but it had already started changing conversations. Back in the city, Camille sat beside her father in the old kitchen, watching the kettle steam. "Do you regret speaking up?" she asked. Malik shook his head. "No, I regret waiting so long." Camille leaned into his shoulder. "I used to think you were quiet because you were afraid, but you were just waiting for the right moment." Malik smiled. Sometimes silence is survival, but sometimes it's surrender. I didn't want to survive anymore. I wanted to live. That weekend, the mayor finally broke his silence and invited Malik to speak at City Hall. The room was packed. City officials, journalists, community leaders. Malik stood at the podium, not in a suit, not in borrowed prestige, but in his work clothes. Blue shirt, name tag, dust on his boots. He cleared his throat. They say I'm a janitor who went viral, he began. But I'm still a janitor, and there's power in that. Because if I can sweep floors with pride, then maybe you can lead this city with a conscience. He paused. Let the silence sit. I don't want a plaque. I don't need a key to the city. I just want change. For my brothers pushing brooms, for the black women cooking your lunches, for the elders working overtime cause retirement never came. See us, hear us, or get used to being shaken awake again and again. He stepped back. No applause at first, just stillness. And then the clapping came. Slow, heavy, real. Not because of performance, but because truth had been spoken again. Later that night, as Malik walked home, he passed a mural being painted on the side of a community center. His face, his mop, but behind him, silhouettes of thousands. The message read, one voice, echoed by millions. And beneath that, in smaller paint, someone had written in bold white letters, Black, Janitor, Hero.